The newly renovated Nixon Library opened to the public on October 14, 2016. A few days before the public was allowed in, we toured the renovated exhibit with Ben Stein, lawyer, writer, actor, political commentator, and Richard Nixon's former speechwriter. Newsmax walked with Ben as he saw and heard the exhibit for the first time.
Dr. Martin Luther King has fallen.
Senator Kennedy has been shot, and possibly shot in the head.
This looks very familiar. I mean, it's hard to imagine how long ago this all was. Just terrible, terrible, terrible riots. And see, the thing was, Nixon had to confront so many challenges. I don't think any president, except for Nixon, has ever had to confront so many challenges all at once. The war in Vietnam, the Cold War with Russia, crisis in the Middle East, student demonstrations, civil rights demonstrations, an upsurge in inflation which made people crazy, and there was a slowdown, a couple of small recessions, but the inflation was making people crazy. It looked like it was going to come undone. Look how close that was. Look how close that was. Wow.
In these difficult years, America has suffered from a fever of words. We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another.
Well, let's walk into the Oval Office.
Yes, by all means.
Look familiar?
It looks wonderful. It looks wonderful. It's funny, I had remembered it as being bigger than this. Is this the exact
This
dimension?
is, yeah, according to the folks at the
Wow.
museum, this is the exact size. This is
Wow, I had remembered it being bigger than this. Well, that's time and place. Brings back many memories. I always remember Mr. Nixon kept his desk so incredibly clean. Incredibly clean. Nixon was absolutely obsessive about keeping his desk clean. I visited him many, many times in San Clemente after he left office. And his office there was very clean too. He was just a very well-organized guy. I mean, extremely well-organized. I'd say the main thing about him, as I think about him now and compare him with the people who are running, is he just knew so damn much. I mean, he just knew so much history. He knew so much more history than Trump or Mrs. Clinton. He just knew, he just was a very well-educated man of his days. He was very well-educated even for his era, and his era was a lot better educated than our era. The guy was just awfully, awfully smart. I mean, you have to think to yourself, here's a guy who came from nowhere. His father was a bus driver, or a streetcar driver, on a tiny little lemon farm. Came from nowhere.
Well, this actually sits on that property.
Yes,
the museum sits on that property.
I know. And he became as erudite a president as there's been in the 20th century. Yeah. And he did it all by himself. He was a self-directed learner.
The museum then shifts from
Great.
his time as a president to back when he was
Richard
Nixon.
A very modest circumstance. But I don't think they ever went hungry, but they were modest circumstances. Look how beautiful his mother was.
Yeah.
Mother was just absolutely beautiful. Just beautiful.
There's a picture of him in high school.
Oh, yeah.
And then in college.
Right, he was always getting hit and hit and hit. It was like the punching bag for the bigger, better, stronger athletes.
That's fascinating that he was so vulnerable, but he was such a tenacious man.
Tenacious, but vulnerable, and really felt it. I mean, he really did not like it when people were mean to him. He remembered it. He was upset about it. And there's a debate between Kennedy and Nixon, and they both did a good job. I mean, there was none of this crazy bitterness that you see in debates. But interestingly enough, I don't know if this museum will cover this or not, but I probably not. But we can cover it, right?
Yes, we can.
We're not owned by the museum
No,
or
we're
by
not.
the government. In the 1960 election, it was clearly stolen from him. I mean, there was just no doubt about it. the Democratic machine in Illinois just made up all kinds of ballots and gave them to Kennedy, so that Nixon should have won Illinois and Kennedy won it, and that decided the election. But Nixon should have won it had there not been this hanky-panky, and Nixon could have contested it the way the Democrats contested the 2000 election, but he didn't contest it because he did not want to tear the country apart. So he did this very, very generous thing of just conceding and not contesting the election. Nixon was a victim of terribly dirty tricks by the other side, by one-sided, one-party media, and still managed to achieve the incredible things he did.
Right around the corner, we're about to walk into the famous Checkers speech.
Yes.
And
That was
he was
funny.
that was
Well,
that was
just-
an amazing speech.
That was a great speech, but that was just a pure slime job in which his opponents just completely made up the idea that he'd been taking money from what they called a slush fund and using money that was donated to him to work on his campaign or donated to him personally by a group of businessmen out in this area, and that he was using it for personal expenses. And he documented down to the penny where it all had all gone.
He showed everybody their personal finances.
Yeah.
I don't know any politician that
No,
did that.
no.
And so now what I am going to do, and incidentally, this is unprecedented in the history of American politics. I am going at this time to give to this television and radio audience a complete financial history. Everything I've earned, everything I've spent, everything I owe. I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything.
My wife, God bless her soul, the most wonderful person in the world, has many fur coats, but sometimes she likes to just wear a cloth coat when we go. She rarely goes out because she's not in good health, and she said, whenever she wears her cloth coat, she always says, "I'm wearing a good Republican cloth coat." Very, oh God, I can hardly bear to look at these. I love him so much, and I still do. I mean, nobody's ever done more for the human race than this man, and look at the way they treated him.
We can't start anywhere but here.
Okay, yes,
Let's
the
go
Vietnam
visit
War.
Vietnam War.
That was horrible. That was just horrible.
At last, Americans are in sight of an end to their commitment in Vietnam, the third most costly war in American history. President Nixon's 8-point plan seeks a withdrawal of all foreign troops from South Vietnam, followed by a ceasefire and free elections.
This was Johnson's
Wow.
last casualty list. When he
Wow.
left it, this was in a safe in the White House bathroom.
Wow.
And when Nixon came in, he opened the safe and found this
Wow.
casualty list.
Wow.
At home, protests against the war persisted. Peace groups staged marches in many cities.
Oh, I knew one boy from my high school who was killed in Vietnam, but even that was too many. I mean, but what could he do? I mean, what could he do? He inherited the war. He couldn't just walk away, or our side would just overrun immediately. He just had to figure out a way to get us out of there slowly so that it looked as if there was at least some resolve on the part of the Americans to fight the communists.
The day we have all worked and prayed for has finally come. For the first time in 12 years, no American military forces are in Vietnam. All of our American POWs are on their way home.
This is the yard at the Hanoi Hilton.
Wow. Well, they actually look better than I thought they would look, although I'm sure they groomed them up for this picture.
Oh yeah, this is clearly like a, let's get the guys out in the yard for a group photograph.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a heartbreaking situation. Just Absolutely heartbreaking. This is a very famous picture.
Yeah.
And there they are coming home. They look so happy, as well they might be. And here comes someone's wife or daughter.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Wow, 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 wow. So wonderful.
This
yeah, that was a
room-
huge thing when Nixon brought home the prisoners of war, because that was a big stumbling block. Nixon insisted that we get the prisoners of war out before, at an early stage of ending the war.
I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Part of his legacy, which I know you like to speak about.
Peacemaker, the
Peacemaker.
ultimate peacemaker, the ultimate peacemaker. And this is-
There's the SALT Treaty right here.
Yeah, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, first one with the Soviets ever. He signed it with Mr. Brezhnev, and the Russians and the U.S. had been building weapons at a furious pace. Slowed down somewhat, didn't by any means abate, didn't by any means end, but it was at least a start in the right direction. Nowadays we have a different problem, which is that too many other countries are getting nuclear weapons, and we don't really have much control over them. And the Russians seem to be abandoning their promises to restrain their arms production and nuclear arms. They seem to have just completely forgotten about that. We had so much worry about nuclear war. It was very, very close to nuclear war when JFK was president. Very, very, very close. We went to Alexandria. Oh, that was one of his last trips before he resigned.
Yeah.
Wow. And here he is in, let's see him in Israel. Wow, the Israelis still love him. It's interesting. I don't know how it is in any other country, but in Israel they still love him. They know that Nixon saved Israel. In the Yom Kippur War, Israel was being beaten. They were in terrible trouble because the Russians had given Egypt anti-aircraft missiles that were nullifying Israel's Air Force advantage. And Nixon rushed jamming devices to the Israelis, took them out of the NATO warehouses against the objections, I believe, of Melvin Laird, who was then Secretary of Defense. Just said, get them to Israel immediately. We're not going to let anybody connect with the Russians win this war. And it worked very, very well. And Israel beat the Egyptians very badly, and then the Egyptians agreed to peace. And that peace has lasted till now.
I know.
You know, the essence of Nixon can be, to me, is summed up by this. He used to say, my goal is to create a lasting structure of peace. Or sometimes he would say, a generation of peace. And we all thought, oh, it's just a slogan, it's just a phrase to help him get elected. He meant it. He really wanted a generation of peace. He really wanted a lasting structure of peace. And until the Islamic fundamentalists came along and wanted to destroy everything, and until Mr. Obama wanted to leave a power vacuum all over the world, the lasting structure of peace was working. As I say, this was just, you cannot imagine what a big moment it was for us Jews when Israel was saved by Nixon. And Mrs. Meir, that's a statue, well, I don't know what we call that, what do you call it, something like that? It's made of metal, it's not a statue.
Yeah.
Something.
A representation of the statue.
It was just, an amazing thing that Nixon saved Israel. And Israel was ready to go nuclear, and Nixon saved the world from that fate.
Well, I want to go back. I want to go back to that for a second,
Yes.
because what amazes me is those two were mortal enemies.
Right, and then
Who
because of Nixon,
became-
they became friends.
Yeah.
And signed a peace agreement, which then was considerably elaborated upon by President Carter and became a more conclusive agreement. But Nixon had, as I say, Mrs. Meir had screwed up the defense of Israel just terribly, absolutely terribly. The Egyptians were doing really, really well. And then Nixon saved Israel, but Israel was about to use nuclear weapons to defend itself. So it would be quite a different world if Israel had done that.
The peace of the world is in our hands. We do not say that in an arrogant sense. We do not say that because we wanted it there. We say that because it's a fact of history. It is there. And what we do or fail to do will determine the fate of 210 million Americans, but also of 3 billion people on this earth, for not only a generation, but perhaps for generations and even centuries to come.
That's an incredible contribution. If that were Richard Nixon's only contribution, it would be an overwhelmingly great contribution. But he also opened up China, strategic arms limitation talks, environmental protection agency. I mean, and this guy was fighting against Congress the whole darn time. I mean, Congress was sniping at him, the media was sniping at him. It was just an endless, endless, endless struggle for Mr. Nixon, and yet what he accomplished, just amazing. Just
Yeah,
amazing.
we're standing in the China room right now.
Yes.
Which is pretty impressive, actually.
The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States is to seek the normalization of relations between the two countries. It is in this spirit that I will undertake what I deeply hope will become a journey for peace.
And imagine the trip for Mrs. Nixon, who'd come from a small town near here and had come from extremely modest circumstances herself.
Right.
And there she was with the President of the United States, visiting the Great Wall of China and meeting with Mao Zedong. But of course, Mao Zedong had come from humble origins too. An awful lot of important people come from humble origins. Really, the only truly great U.S. presidents who did not come from humble origins, I would say, were the Roosevelts and George Washington. Well, I guess Jefferson too. It's just amazing what Nixon was able to accomplish.
And what is a bit of a puzzle to me is why over the years, well, I guess maybe, do you think our view has softened of him over the years?
I think young people have a much better view of him. I know I'm an endless propagandist for Nixon, so when people say to me, what was Nixon like? I always say, the greatest peacemaker there's ever been. And he was the greatest peacemaker there's ever been. Ever. And that resonates with people. And to me, I always think, when I think of Nixon, that I believe it was Jesus who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And I think in the Old Testament it says that the greatest title that the Lord can give to any person is peacemaker. Right. And Nixon was the ultimate peacemaker. I mean, interestingly enough, construed as combative, agreed he was combative, agreed he was aggressive, but in the end, peacemaker. I think there can be no exaggeration of the fact that his mother was a Quaker. His mother believed in peace. He was very, very much influenced by his mother. And but Nixon wasn't that interested in economics, but he was very interested in peace, very, very interested in peace. And wow, he really made some steps. I mean, we live in a world of peace largely because of Nixon.
It's fascinating. Well, let's take a walk, see some of the stuff.
And it's also interesting to me that the whole of Asia, and especially China,
right,
was opened up, and people's lives were improved on a scale which can hardly be imagined. Think of what it meant to the ordinary person in China for Nixon to have come there and changed his life. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. King Timoho, Pasha, and Vicky. That's the dog's names. King Timoho, Pasha, and Vicky. When I used to go see Mr. Nixon in San Clemente after he left office, he would have his dog sitting at his feet as he sat in his easy chair, and he'd be petting his dog. It was very, very nice, very, very nice. And bear in mind, while this was happening, they were still having the Great Cultural Revolution in China, which was a very violent time. And I think partly because of Nixon's visit and the just general cooling of temperatures, the Cultural Revolution came to an end, and many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives were saved. I don't think there's ever been a president responsible for the saving of more lives than Mr. Nixon. I think something people don't realize is that in terms of innovation, Nixon was in a class by himself. I mean, an Environmental Protection Agency, nobody had thought of doing that before. And something that I don't see here, but I worked on, so I know it happened, is that we had Nixon sent up the first proposal to Congress for national health care, because he believed that there should not be any American who could not get health care. There should be no American so poor or so out of the loop, one might say, that he or she couldn't get health care. And so we sent up a proposal to have a complex, but nowhere near as complex as Obamacare, health care system in which the government would ensure that every citizen, rural, suburban, urban, any race, men and women, could get health care, and if they were poor enough, they would get it for free. And that was killed as soon as it got to Congress by Teddy Kennedy, who just hated Nixon and would kill anything Nixon did, just out of pure malice. But Nixon had that was his first, he was the first guy ever to do it. Truman had talked about it, Truman had discussed it, but he never sent up the bill to Congress, whereas Nixon actually did. Now this is something, and Nixon, by the way, also desegregated the last of the southern school districts. When he took office, a very large percentage of the southern school districts were still integrated by law in their states or counties.
Right.
And when he left office, even though he left prematurely, there are almost none, maybe none, were still segregated by law. So he was very big on civil rights for blacks, and it's kind of interesting to me that for some reason, I don't know why, I really don't know why, blacks are so solidly Democratic, because the Republican Party has been so solidly for civil rights. What he did, among many other things, was create affirmative action. People don't realize this, but Mr. Nixon was the one who insisted that there be a certain quota of jobs. Oh, by the way, there's Bob Brown, who was the first person I worked for at the White House, that there be a certain quota of jobs on federal projects reserved for minorities. And that was the first affirmative action there had ever been in federal employment. He was for the Equal Rights Amendment. I believe he was the only post-war Republican president to have been for the Equal Rights Amendment. He's the only one that didn't get passed, but he was for it. And I don't think anyone gives him any credit for that whatsoever, at all, none, zero.
No man can be fully free while his neighbor is not. To go forward at all is to go forward together. This means black and white together as one nation, not two.
The highest court of the land has spoken. The unitary school system must replace the dual school system throughout the United States.
The first major civil rights acts since Reconstruction were done under Eisenhower and Nixon, and Republicans get no credit for that at all. It's just astonishing to me.
Why is that? I have to ask you that. Why is it? What
The media has
happened?
decided that they would just hang a big Ku Klux Klan robe over the Republican Party, and somehow people let them get away with it. And of course, it's not true. It has nothing to do with reality at all. Not even remotely does it have anything to do with reality at all. Not even remotely. And yet, that's unfortunately the way it's been. Now, I was there that day. I was there that day.
Were you really?
I wasn't in the office with Mr. Nixon, and I wasn't working at the White House that day. I was working at the Federal Trade Commission, and my father was at the White House, and I was having lunch with him in the White House mess, which is this very, very nice room where people at the White House could eat if they're at a certain level. And he's sitting there with my father, and my father sort of leaned forward and said, "Would you recognize Elvis Presley if you saw him in person?" And I said, "Well, of course." And he said, "Well, don't look now, but he's sitting right behind you." So I said, "Well, that's impossible." He said, "Well, have a look." So I turned around, and there was Elvis Presley eating lunch with Bob Haldeman, who was chief of staff. And I got up and I said, "Mr. Presley, everyone in the world is your fan, but I'm your biggest fan." And he said, "Thank you very much." And but anyway, so that a few minutes after that, Mr. Presley went over and had lunch. I had just a handshake and said hello to to Mr. Nixon, how the president and the king, as the saying goes. Really amazing.
Nixon enfranchised voters 18 and older.
Right.
He
18
lowered the
21.
voting age,
Yes.
knowing, to me, what's fascinating about that, knowing that he was enfranchising a group of voters
But
who
he-
were opposed, who were going to be opposed to him.
Some were not. I think he got the majority of the 18 to 21 vote in the 72 election. I'm pretty sure he did.
Really?
Yeah, because everyone thinks of the 18 to 21-year-olds as being hippies and drug takers and banging drums and so forth, but a lot of them were conservatives and a lot of them liked Nixon quite a bit. His daughters are saints. Now, I do not know Tricia as well as I would like to, but I know Julie very, very well. In fact, I was just on email with her several times earlier today. She's a goddess. Except for my wife, I'd say she's the finest woman I know. She's just a goddess. And I think even bitter enemies of Mr. Nixon have said that he has to have been quite a remarkable man to have had such fine children. If you could create a ratio of achievement to appreciation of achievement, Nixon would have the highest score in the history of the world because his achievements were absolutely beyond reason, and the appreciation of them at the time was negative.
Yeah.
But I think it's improved quite considerably, and it will improve more. Although Nixon said the ultimate smart thing about this. When asked how history would treat him, he said it depends on who writes the history. That's the San Clemente.
Ah.
Yes. He had quite a place there. It was magnificent. Nobody except someone like Warren Buffett could have afforded to buy a house like that now. I mean, prices have gone up so much, but it was a fabulous house.
Why would he ever move from there? Because he moved from there back to New
moved,
Jersey.
Yeah,
right?
because he wanted to be near his daughters.
Really?
Yeah.
No, we're going to be entering into the darker side of Nixon's life.
Sadder side.
Yeah, the
Very
sadder side, yeah.
Very sadder side.
I mean, before we got there, though, ironically, and you can see it on this map up here, he won in an unprecedented
Yes.
landslide.
Well, he
Probably
won.
what you will never see again. I can't
I
imagine.
hope
that.
we don't see it this time. We
Yeah.
might see it this time, but we don't. But yeah, Nixon was a master campaigner. He ran a masterful campaign, and he had done, people were very grateful that he was ending the war in Vietnam, and it's incredible. Isn't it incredible to think that Nixon won New York,
Yeah.
won California, won Pennsylvania, won Michigan, won everything. He won everything except Massachusetts.
And we go from this to 2 years later to the exhibit that's around the corner,
I know.
which is,
I know, it's so heart-rending, just heart-rending. And no one has ever credibly alleged that Nixon had anything to do with the break-in at all. And there has been no reason for Nixon to have gone in there. There was nothing in there worth having. So I have no idea whatsoever why they went in. I don't think anyone knows why they went in. I mean, why did they go in? I don't think anyone knew why they went in. Why the Nixon White House definitely had something to do with this break-in into the psychiatrist for Daniel Ellsberg.
Ellsberg, yeah.
But that I don't know why they did that either. Who cared about that? That Ellsberg was revealing things about was revealing things about things that had happened under Kennedy and Johnson. He wasn't revealing much about Nixon. I have no idea why they did that. I mean, that didn't make any sense. And I don't think that, as I say, I don't think anybody really knows what they were looking for. They got caught because there was a piece of tape there. They didn't produce any usable intelligence. I have no idea what they were what they were looking for. I don't think anyone knows what they were looking for to this day. What were they looking for? I mean, it's just a mystery what they were looking for.
How does this scandal compare in terms of contemporary times?
Well, it's not the same as destroying 33,000 emails that are under congressional subpoena.
Right.
So let's put it like that. If Nixon destroyed 33,000 emails that are under congressional subpoena, they would have hanged him. But so it's nothing even remotely in that league, not even remotely. So I don't know how to compare it with that. But I mean, and Nixon had nothing to do with ordering the break-in. He tried to help cover it up. He didn't do a very good job at it. But then the media piled on. The media had always hated him. Had just hated him from the days when he was a congressman, from the days when he was a senator, from the days when he was a vice president. And I always assumed that was because A, he was anti-communist, and B, because he had a kind of a vulnerable personality. Everyone watching this probably went to elementary school and knows that there are schoolyard bullies and they pick on the kid who cries.
Right.
The guy who doesn't cry, they leave him alone. The guy who cries, they pick on him. Nixon was a very sensitive guy. I mean, he pretended he was tough, but he wasn't. He was a very sensitive guy. And so they picked on him.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
I was here in this room when this happened, and it was heart-rending. It was the saddest of sad moments.
What's that?
When the Nixon farewell to the White House staff. I mean, you cannot imagine what a heartbreaking moment that was.
This isn't the biggest house. Many are, and most, and even smaller countries are much bigger. But this is the best house. It's the best house because it has something far more important than numbers of people who serve, far more important than numbers of rooms or how big it is, far more important than numbers of magnificent pieces of art. This house has a great heart, and that heart comes from those who serve.
And if we watch this for a while, you'll probably see either me or my parents or both. I was there with at that point, my wife and I were divorced. Is that me? I think it is.
That's you?
Yeah. And there's Nixon. It was so heartbreaking. I mean, just, you cannot imagine how heartbreaking it was.
Well, it's interesting. We can't hear the audio. We can see the transcript. But listening to this speech when I walked through it, it's a really moving
It's
speech.
incredibly moving. It's incredibly moving. It's really a look into his soul. It's just, I remember I was just standing there sobbing, and my mother and father were seated. That's my mother right there. That's my mother right there.
Huh?
Sitting just a few feet away, sobbing. I never saw my mother cry so much in her whole life as when Nixon left. Nixon was a god in our family. I mean, he was not just my father's boss, he was a god in our family.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. And so we leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility, and with very,
much gratefulness in our hearts.
He mostly gave it from the heart, and those anecdotes about my father was he was a streetcar conductor or something like that. He owned a lemon farm. It was the poorest lemon farm in California. He sold it before they discovered oil on it. My mother was a great woman. No one will ever name any schools after her, but she was a great woman. And it was an incredibly wrenching day. I remember it was a very, very hot day in August, and boy, did we feel bad. Wow, did we feel bad. I mean, you can't quite imagine how bad we felt about Mr. Nixon. We all loved him. I mean, I don't think there was a person on the White House staff who didn't just revere him. I only remember one incident when he was even slightly curt to a White House employee, and he was walking out of a press conference with Ron Ziegler, who was the press secretary, who was a great guy, and Ron Ziegler was sort of in his way, and Nixon sort of shoved him. Oh my God! Well, they've cut this off because that was this went on for about 30 or 40 minutes.
They're leaving here and they're coming out of the White House over here on this video.
There is the man who will be president in another couple of hours, Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty Ford.
And there's the president waving goodbye. You hear the applause.
You can see them walking across the lawn.
Well, you can put this up on YouTube on, see the RN farewell to the White House.
But there they are leaving now.
Oh yeah, I remember. I was standing watching them. It was just so sad. It was unbelievable. And that wonderful Betty Ford and Mr. Ford. Yeah, what a great museum this is.
He loved the Lincoln Room. He loved the sitting room.
And I think I have this right. I believe I have this right. I don't think you have this quite totally right, because you do have it right. Because I was going to say it had a beautiful marble fireplace in it, and it was a working fireplace. And it used to have the fireplace on and the air conditioning on at the same time. And everybody thought that was so incredible. But actually, if you think about it, it's a good idea. It gives you that nice feel of the fireplace and the nice feel of the air conditioning. Oh God, Mr. Nixon, we need you back. We need you back very badly.
It's remarkable. Bill Clinton gave a very moving eulogy.
Very moving. Julie was sitting right in front of us. There's Tricia. There's my mother and father. And I was sitting just a few seats down from them. And at a certain moment, they had 3 jet fighters fly right overhead. Right overhead. It was very, very moving. It was just incredibly moving. It was in the days when there was still rain, and we had some rain. Just notice how unhappy Mrs. Clinton looks. She didn't want them to go. Sorry. I'll tell you something interesting, if I may. I came to the funeral. Mrs. Julie was kind enough to get me a seat literally right behind her. So if you see Julie, you'll see me and my wife sitting behind her. But if you see it from a certain angle. But anyway, that big boulevard out there, Yorba Linda Boulevard, big boulevard, it was crammed with tens of thousands of people. The LA Times never said a word about it. They're such sons of bitches. They never said a word about it. The whole area around here turned out to honor him. And the LA Times never said a word about it. Just amazing. Oh, that's great.
So much
Now
about
that's actually a pretty good picture of Mrs. Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
There's my mother and father.
Yeah. He was a deeply human man.
Oh, he was very human. He was very human. There was no, he was not an artificial character, and he was not a braggart. And I mean, he would brag about the accomplishments of his administration and his party, but he would never brag about himself. He'd never say, like, I've got $10 billion, or I understand the tax code better than any person in the world. Look at Julie. Look what a sweet, 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 sweet girl she is. That's the brother. That's my mother. That's my mother and my father. God, I never saw anything like the way my parents loved the Nixons. Well, I mean, that's rather a small part of the story here.
This is it. This is where it all ends, as a matter of fact. It's Mr. Ford.
Yes, he was a great man too. A great, great man. Here's Jimmy Carter. Bush. Mr. Reagan. But there's a picture that was flashing up here of Mr. Nixon hugging Tricia. I mean, Julie hugging Julie. And it's one of the most moving pictures you've ever seen in your life. It's just incredibly moving. There he is in China. The whole world is different because he went to China. Why didn't he get the Nobel Peace Prize? They gave it to Obama just for breathing and eating.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very good question, isn't it?
It is.
It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.